From the time of Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration in 1933 to the beginning of World War II 8 years later, the federal government is engaged in a broad and diverse series of experiments to combat the devastating effects of the Great Depression. The crusade begins only days after FDR takes office.
An extraordinary number of bills went up to the Hill from the White House in these so-called first 100 days, and there was no debate. So in terms of the two branches of government, executive and legislative, FDR enjoyed extraordinary power.
In a sense, I think you could argue that in many ways, Roosevelt's only unvarnished success as president, and maybe the only unvarnished real success of the New Deal, was that continuous infusion of optimism that FDR had, and that I think was contagious. I think he never doubted that his programs at some point were going to work, even though he would change those programs from year to year, from time to time. And he was able, I think, to convey this kind of boundless optimism to the American people in his fireside chats.
Radio was new, of course, and no previous president had used it except in a very minimal way. And his fireside chats, which were delivered in a very simple kind of language, had a tremendous impact in making Roosevelt a part of everyday life in the minds of ordinary Americans.
The radio stations, not knowing who was listening or what they thought of the shows, begged people to write letters. Herbert Hoover, who directly preceded Roosevelt, got 800 letters a day. Franklin Roosevelt got 8,000 women writing to Roosevelt saying, I'm going to have a baby and I need money. Can you lend me $25 to buy a layette for my baby? And then they'd send them a list of the things they needed. And they sent him recipes. And they say things like, when Mrs. Roosevelt is mixing the spinach into the eggs, tell her not to be too forceful with eggs. So they're making Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt simple people in the kitchen cooking together. But perhaps more importantly, they're also writing him about issues. They're telling him what they believe. They're thanking him for helping them. They're spanking him for not doing the things he ought to be doing. What's most moving is how eloquent the American people are, even those letters that are written by people who can't spell at all, who in fact will spell one word 3 different times in the short letter.
The audience for Roosevelt's fireside chats sometimes reaches 80 million, over half of the people in the country.
They listened to him in theaters. They'd just stop the movie and play his speech, and then they'd go on with the movie. My favorite example is a baseball game being played by the New York Giants and the Boston Braves, two teams that don't exist anymore. And he was giving one of his early wartime chats. And it was a tied ball game in the 4th or 5th inning at the Polo Grounds in New York. They stopped the game, and he spoke for 40 minutes, and you can see pictures in the Times of baseball players sitting in the stands.
From his first days in office, the president surrounds himself with a cadre of bright, capable assistants.
Historically, the White House staff was not terribly important. Lincoln had, a couple of secretaries, a very, very tiny number of people around him. But when the United States government exploded in size during the Roosevelt years, both in fighting the Depression and the Second World War, suddenly the White House staff became quite central, going from just a handful of people, it suddenly became 300, 400, 500 people.
My first experience in politics, coming back from study abroad in 1935, and getting a job in Roosevelt's Washington, an incredibly exciting time, almost like being in the Continental Congress 1774. And that's where we got jobs and started to remake the world, and we did.
Roosevelt's closest advisors are referred to as the Brain Trust.
What perhaps distinguished the Brain Trust from, earlier cadres of advisors that surrounded presidents in the past, aside from its size, that these were all individuals who were willing, to use the common phrase today, think outside of the box. And he was very good at manipulating his cadre of advisors. When I say manipulate, I don't mean that in a negative term. He was manipulating them with particular goals in mind. Let two people fight it out to the death about a policy proposal. This way, FDR could ensure a kind of very high level of debate and discussion among his advisors, out of which would presumably come inspired policy choices, at least effective ones.
He changed the terms of politics and opened up politics in a very profound way to those who had been on the margins, both for economic reasons and for reasons of cultural heritage. He had a comfort level with these individuals that very few other presidents had, and many immigrants and children of immigrants felt the attraction of Roosevelt very powerfully.
The administration's initial actions, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, are stopgap measures intended to buy time to develop more comprehensive programs.
And there had long been a plan for the government to be a kind of buyer of last resort when national and international crop prices were low. One of the first things that the new agricultural policy did was to require farmers to plow under crops that were already planted and to slaughter livestock so as to reduce the amount of produce that would be flooding into the agricultural market. There was a lot of criticism of this, understandably, with so many people hungry.
The consequence of that, of course, was in many ways to boost the income of some of the farmers who, of course, owned the land. But it did not really revive the economy because, to a large extent, the New Deal farm programs were simply requiring consumers to pay a little bit more for their bread and for their eggs and their milk, transferring wealth from, say, the urban consumers to the countryside, but it was not really increasing the total wealth in the society.
The politics of creating an intrusive arm of the government that was going to tell people, farmers, what they could grow and what they couldn't grow. It was such political dynamite that understandably the Roosevelt administration decided they were going to have to empower local farmers to a great degree to make these decisions. Well, that's probably fine in parts of Iowa, but in the South, that meant that white landholders were making decisions not only about their land, but also about all the people who worked on their land, white and black sharecroppers. And on top of that, there was every incentive for the white planter to receive payments from Washington to take land out of cultivation, keep those payments, and not pass along any money to sharecroppers, because the planter didn't need them anymore.
It wasn't long after the New Deal was criticized for the agricultural program that Roosevelt began to promote, for example, things like the Farm Security Administration, which did begin to provide some direct federal aid to sharecroppers. He also launched something called the Subsistence Homestead Program, which was intended to provide a kind of government program to allow former tenant farmers and sharecroppers to buy a piece of land.
In the face of this economic crisis, business leaders push for relaxation of antitrust regulations. The National Industrial Recovery Act provides the relief they want, but demands certain concessions in return.
Basically, it was an effort to create a system through which industries could cooperate with one another to restrict production and to agree on a uniform range of prices for goods. All of this had been illegal under the antitrust acts for price fixing. As a price for it, however, they added a major public works program to pump money into the economy to provide jobs.
Section 7A of the NRA, which relates to labor, which basically is interpreted by the labor movement as meaning that the government now endorses trade unionism as the way to organize labor. This is a new position for government, and it leads to a huge upsurge in labor organizing. The NRA, however, is declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court.
And the experiment was, although a great public relations success for a time, an economic failure, because it served in the end to restrict economic activity by providing cover for employers to retrench and to produce less and to protect themselves from the market.
At first, the Roosevelt administration does not consider relief for the unemployed a top priority. And yet, something has to be done to help impoverished Americans survive.
One of the things that Roosevelt did that cemented his relationship with ordinary people most effectively was to create a huge range of relief mechanisms that would get money into the hands of people who were unemployed. Some of this was just giving money to relief agencies, state and local, and even private relief agencies. But a lot of it was creating jobs. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which hired young people from the cities to work in national parks and in rural areas. The Civil Works Administration, which created public works projects to hire people. And perhaps most famously, the Works Progress Administration, which created a whole range of jobs, from industrial construction jobs to jobs for artists and writers and musicians.
In his State of the Union message of 1935, he denounced the dole, that is to say, giving cash relief to people who are out of work. It creates dependency. People lose faith in themselves. They don't look for work and so on. He said, no, the remedy for poverty is work, not relief.
He uses the economic resources of the federal government to keep working class people believing in this political system. And to the amazement of black people, he includes them among the working class people that he is going to see as the beneficiaries of the New Deal. And they begin to vote for him in ever-increasing numbers.
Some of the most strident attacks on the New Deal come from critics on the right who believe Roosevelt is threatening capitalism and waging war against the wealthy.
And those critics of Roosevelt hated him with a passion that few presidents have ever encountered. People who wouldn't even allow his name to be said in the House, people who celebrated 13 years later when he died. But Roosevelt had criticism from many other areas as well, and the left at various times was highly critical of Roosevelt for being too conservative, for being too much a capitalist, for being too much committed to preserving existing institutions. This government that was trying so many different things was perhaps inevitably arousing opposition from almost every part of the political spectrum.
3 protest movements in particular have a national impact. One led by California physician Francis Townsend.
An elderly man who saw the plight of the elderly around him in the Depression and came up with a plan for providing old age pensions to all Americans over 65 on the provision that they retire and open up jobs for younger people. This plan developed enormous popular support and even considerable interest in Congress. A second of these national movements was led by Father Charles Coughlin, who was a priest in the area just outside of Detroit that served auto workers. He began talking about the importance of making more currency available, even nationalizing the banks. The most important protest figure of the 1930s was probably Huey Long, who was the governor of Louisiana and later a senator from Louisiana, who created a movement called the Share Our Wealth Society, which would take money away from wealthy people and give it to poor people. And they would guarantee everybody a minimal income and a minimal level of wealth. It was a fantastic scheme. It was completely unworkable, but it contributed to the sense of unhappiness with the slow and moderate course of the New Deal that produced the so-called Second New Deal.
The year 1935 is often heralded as the wonderful year of the New Deal, with a major revision of banking laws that strengthens the role of the Federal Reserve, the so-called Soak the Rich tax law, passage of the Public Utility Holding Company Act, the Social Security Act, and the National Labor Relations Act.
Taken together, that legislation in 1935 is much more focused upon providing government assistance and direct government aid to the disadvantaged, which you really didn't have in 1933 or 1934. So in 1935 and 1936, the New Deal moves in a much more class-conscious way to really provide programs to the forgotten Americans.
By 1935, it becomes apparent that Roosevelt's own political future may be linked to the fortunes of the American workforce.
Roosevelt comes to office, he gives a sense of hope and experimentation, passes a few laws, and this has the effect of galvanizing a labor movement, of bringing millions of workers into unions, of unions putting forth demands for decent treatment at the workplace, for decent wages, for decent hours, for some guarantee of a wage that would allow them to support their family.
There's massive organizing waves and strike waves in all sorts of industries, from auto to mining, all throughout the country. A labor upsurge which hasn't been seen for more than a decade in the United States.
A number of labor leaders, most notably John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers, began proposing a new system for organizing workers, industrial unionism, through which all workers in an industry, skilled and unskilled alike, would be brought together in a single union to maximize the bargaining power of the union. The AFL staunchly opposed this movement.
And there was a split. And out of that split comes the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which seeks to organize workers on the basis of the whole industry. From nothing, they become almost as large as the AFL in a few years. It changes the nature of work relations in the factories. It also changes politics in the United States, because the CIO becomes very politically involved.
John L. Lewis brought this incredible sense of determination to building these unions, which was no easy thing because it meant organizing the biggest companies in the world, General Motors, U.S. Steel, Ford Motor Company.
All of this ferment, both within the labor movement and among rank-and-file workers, ultimately helped produce pressure for the really landmark piece of labor legislation, which was the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, the so-called Wagner Act, which reaffirmed the right of workers to bargain collectively with employers through unions, but also created the National Labor Relations Board, which became an effective enforcement mechanism for that right.
Employers are prohibited from doing things they'd always done, like fire union organizers, like tell their workers that if they join a union, the plant's going to close. And that's the protection they needed.
There are strikes, and many of them are very violent, until the Supreme Court upholds the National Labor Relations Act. And then many of the more intelligent business leaders say, look, a strong labor union will provide discipline to the labor force, will be able to negotiate industry-wide contracts that will level the playing field.
From the earliest moments of the New Deal, members of the administration, most notably Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, have been lobbying for a system of federally sponsored social insurance for the elderly and the unemployed.
I remember when I was working on speeches, what we had to do was to convince people the government could help them. They didn't have any idea that government had a role in taking care of people who were thrown out of jobs. That had always been done by local government.
As it turns out, the original 1935 legislation is just the first step in launching the concept of a welfare state.
In 1939, there was an important change to the Social Security Act that would have enormous repercussions for welfare and welfare politics. That change was for the purposes of advancing family security. And the central amendment had to do with creating the survivors insurance system for the widowed survivors of elderly workers who themselves, as widows, hadn't, say, been in the labor force, so hadn't paid into the system. But in addition to that kind of a benefit, the survivors insurance system created a benefit for widowed mothers and minor children of male workers who had been insured under the Social Security system.
Even with the outpouring of legislation in 1935, Roosevelt's prospects for re-election in 1936 seem in doubt.
There was some possibility that the senator from Louisiana, Huey Long, might possibly become a third-party candidate challenging Roosevelt. Had Long not been assassinated, but once Long was out of the picture, there was very little doubt that Roosevelt was the only real alternative in 1936.
When the Republicans nominated Alf Landon, Democrats, in effect, breathed a sigh of relief because they didn't really believe that Alf Landon was going to be a candidate who could threaten Roosevelt.
Alf Landon had a fairly progressive record in terms of his approach to agricultural problems. He was not known for, deep hostility toward organized labor. And basically, the approach of the Republican Party was to say, well, we believe that the New Deal has gone a little bit too far in terms of the intrusion of the government into, say, the private economic sector. But we're not opposed to everything the New Deal has done. We will simply manage the programs in a more efficient and a more effective way.
Roosevelt ran a very aggressive campaign in 1936 in which he, for the first time really, openly attacked capitalists, openly attacked rich people, openly attacked what he called the plutocrats, the people who hated him.
He was saying, look, if you believe that the rich and the powerful have the answer to America's problems, you should vote for Mr. Landon. But if you are not among the rich and the powerful, you should vote for me because the New Deal will help you more than will the Republican Party.
And all of these things combined to create tremendous excitement around Roosevelt's campaign. Of course, the people who hated him even more as a result, but they were a small minority. And the result was the greatest landslide in American history to that point.
This mandate, Franklin Roosevelt believes, makes it possible for him to challenge his nemesis, the Supreme Court.
Legislatures were passing all these laws to help the working men and women. And the Supreme Court was repeatedly declaring that those laws were unconstitutional. Roosevelt lived in fear in 1936 that the Supreme Court would overturn the two cornerstones of his New Deal, the Wagner Act and the Social Security Act.
So after the 1936 election, he tried to do something that in retrospect seems very reckless, but in his own mind at the time seemed necessary, which was to deal with the problem of the Supreme Court.
Roosevelt's scheme was to say that for any sitting Supreme Court member age 70 or over, he was going to add one more Supreme Court justice. And there were enough Supreme Court justices who were 70 or older, so that this meant he was going to be able to pack the court with his nominees who would then put through his legislation.
It was a crude effort, and he failed in the legislature, but he woke the court up to the fact that they had gone too far, and they switched all of a sudden.
It is true that the toes of some people are being stepped on.
The traditional view is that they did it to undermine support for the court-packing bill. But a number of legal historians have argued that in fact what the court was doing was responding to the sloppiness through which the New Deal had drafted its early legislation. I think there's probably some truth in both views.
In the summer of 1937, the national income comes close to reaching pre-Depression levels. Roosevelt uses this as an excuse to cut programs in order to balance the budget. But within months, the fragile boom collapses.
The recession that began in the fall of 1937 plunged the economy back into depths worse than anything that had happened since early 1933. And this was a kind of wake-up call to the Roosevelt administration. The measures they were using, although they were helping a lot of people, weren't ending the economic problems. By this time, there was within the New Deal a small but influential cohort of people who were beginning to argue that the best way to end the Depression was for the government to increase its spending so as to create economic activity. So the New Deal didn't end in 1937, it just took a different course.
In the 1930s, Roosevelt's principal critics are conservatives who accuse him of abandoning the Constitution and establishing a tyrannical state. In recent years, critics point instead to the problems the New Deal did not resolve and the important groups it failed to represent.
The president, at the time of the New Deal, and historians ever since, have often spoken of the 3 R's of the New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief focused on the hardship of the unemployed and the dispossessed. Recovery, the economic problem of recovery. And reform, how to reform the operations of the economy so this kind of crisis would never be repeated. On relief, we give the New Deal an A or even an A+. A lot of money was expended simply to feed, clothe, and house those most unfortunate. It's become an enduring legacy of the New Deal that the federal government should, when necessary, always stand as last resort in a moment of great national crisis. The activities to reform the workings of banks and the financial system. This is also an enduring legacy of the New Deal. It exists to this day. Some of these reform efforts were very effective, like the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Some of them were failures. So let's give the New Deal a B or a B- in that area. And then we come to recovery, getting the economy up off its back and getting it to resume growth in a robust way after the collapse from 1929 to 1933. Unfortunately here, the New Deal gets very low marks. An ungenerous grader might give it a D. A generous grader might give it an incomplete, because the recovery efforts of the New Deal don't seem to have any staying power at all. Once the war formally begins in September of 1939, growth really starts to take off, and of course when the U.S. enters the war in December of 1941, the economy skyrockets. But that's not the New Deal. That's the war.
I think you have to think of the New Deal as this huge sort of stew pot of ideas and experiments and efforts, some of which worked, some of which didn't, some of which now seem preposterous, some of which were dazzlingly innovative and effective. And what the New Deal is remembered as today is not the same as what the New Deal was during its own life, in which so many different things were going on that not even people within the administration could keep up with them all. And the fact that many of these experiments failed and were abandoned shouldn't distract us from remembering that this was a presidency and an administration that was willing to try almost anything, and did. What did work ended up being very important to the 1930s and to the future of American public policy.
Position or riches or both by some short cut that is harmful to the greater good.
The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.